I'm really excited today. I've known Bob Seawright. I haven't known Bob Seawright, but I have read Bob Seawright for about over a decade now. He is the Chief Investment and Information Officer for Madison Avenue Securities, LLC in San Diego, California. And in 2014, the Wall Street Journal published a list of the 15 smart people for investors to follow. And he's on the list with none other than Warren Buffett, Howard Marks, William Bernstein. Now, I need to get this out of the way right up at the top because there are three financial writers that I read everything they do: Jason Zweig, Morgan Housel, and Bob Seawright. So I'm really excited to have you on today. I've been reading Above the Market for over a decade. I think I started reading it in 2012. I think you started it maybe the year before then. And if you add to that the Better Letter, I think you're the king of long form financial writing. But the best part is you make it fun. Like, you make it digestible. You bring in pop culture and music references every single week. And I don't know how you get those huge long pieces out there. It's pretty incredible. So your writing is found everywhere, all over the web. You end up on every best of list. You took the time to write a nice blurb for my book, and I never got a chance to thank you for that publicly. So thank you. And I know you write about. I know what you write about. I know I introduced Terry to the Better Letter, so she's read a little bit as well. But none of our listeners necessarily know. So let's tell us in your own words a little bit of your path professionally and your writing.
Sure. And thank you for those excessively kind words. I went to school to become a lawyer, and I practiced law for 10 years, and I hated it. I did litigation about half the time. I did deals about half the time. If you think reading prospectuses are a lousy way to spend your time, writing them is worse. I started writing Above the Market, as you said, Jonathan, about 10 years ago. And then a little over a year ago, partly because of COVID, and I had a little more time, and my wife was already thinking I was spending too much time working. So I decided to write a newsletter, partly because I wanted to put something out regularly, but mostly because I wanted to expand the scope of what I talked about. You mentioned Jason Zweig, and Jason has said to me, and he's written it publicly, that he writes the same, I think it's 14 columns over and over with different fact patterns in different contexts. And, after 10 years and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of posts, I was ready to broaden the scope a little bit. I still write a lot about finance, but that's not all I write about. And so far, so good. I think the response has been pretty positive.
So I wanted to just kick off with the sort of the question on which we maybe founded this podcast, which is, what's your definition of true life success? Do you have some kind of, is that a question you ask yourself? And if so, what are kind of the composite elements of that?
It is. It's something I ask myself all the time. Really, all the best things in our lives compound, with time and patience being crucial. Those things, they're nice, they work, they're helpful. And then if you keep at it long enough and carefully enough, it suddenly explodes into something truly wonderful. And I'm old enough to have seen some real examples of that in my life. And so if I can pass to my to the next generation some of the fruits of that, but also the lessons of that, that's a pretty good start.
So if I can kind of just like maybe go back in a little bit. So if we're talking about like success with like a capital S, You mentioned purpose. And so it seems as if you're hinting that it's something that's really self-defined. I mean, what Jonathan and I come up against again and again in the show is that we have kind of the external markers of success. So like your bank balance, if you're an athlete, the number of medals you won, things like that, maybe university degrees, like specific things that everybody can look at and say, that looks like success. And then there's this whole aspect of like how you define personally what ends up looking like a fulfilling life for you. And so I wonder if you could maybe just kind of like make the link between those two things, because you mentioned purpose, but like at the same time you use the vehicle of like financial investing to become successful, I suppose, financially. So how do those two things kind of tie together?
If you spend your time focusing on what the neighbors have, or what your friends have, or what your colleagues have, or even worse, what your competitors have, your life is going to be miserable, because there are always going to be people that have it better than you in one way or the other. And you have to start with what you're after, and you measure your success by how well you've gotten what you're after.
I think many people still are, well, many people, like 99.99% of us are still hung up on, what my neighbor has. And I think that's the big challenge, is not financializing everything in the world. So a lot of your writing actually.
That's a societal problem too, right? We've financialized everything.
Everything.
Not just in terms of measurement. The early in the COVID crisis, I wrote about the value of a life, because we were talking about, at that time, from a policy standpoint, whether and how to shut down, and how much, and what to do about business. And the federal government has specifically done research to value a life in terms of what outside the context of COVID, whether certain regulation is going to be required or not, based on lives it saved, with a presumed value per life. And we do it that way, but we turn every asset into money, instead of the asset being an asset for its own sake. Is it valuable because it's beautiful and you love it? Anyway, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, but I think it's very interesting. I think like the answer is, it kind of is both. And like I agree, like by living in the system in which we exist today, there's this tendency to like put a price tag on everything and then measure its value in those terms. But at the same time, like if I can sort of play devil's advocate and say something for the external markers of success, like having had an athletic background, let's say, like I spend a lot of my life specifically chasing medals. And like when I think about, what those things are worth today, I mean, they're a piece of plastic sitting on the shelf. But like ultimately, like the pinnacles of human achievement often end up being on the way to that kind of quest, right? Like, I mean, if you're trying to win an Olympic gold medal, like your goal is, I'm going to do the best performance necessary to win that medal. And on the way there, you push the package of what's possible for humanity. So, I mean, if one were to then like put that back into the financial world, like, I come from a real estate background. And when I look at like some of the investors around me who are doing an amazing job, like part of it's about money, but part of it is about them also just getting really good at what they do. And then money becomes a consequence. So I don't know, like, if we can sort of completely dismiss external markers and say they don't correlate at all with achievement, or they're kind of not useful in that sense. I don't know.
Well, I think they're useful. It's the world we live in, right? If we made no money, it'd be pretty difficult to survive. Certainly to the with the lifestyle. At least everyone, I suspect, who's going to watch this podcast has become accustomed. And external markers can be helpful if everyone you read, talk to, think about looks like you, thinks like you, and does things like you. It's pretty hard to get better. And all you can do then is just work harder. And if there's something you could be doing better and you don't know about it, you're never going to come close to reaching your potential, whether that's an Olympic gold medal or being a better parent.
I mean, there's your better letter for tomorrow. That's compounding, right? It's the it's the little mini efforts we make to get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better, that create health, they create better relationships, they create, financial success. It all comes from that. I'm committed to getting a little bit better. And I think that's, Terry and I talk a lot about that actually in our own interviews and all the time. I actually want to get to some bias conversation. At the same time, I want to pull on one more thread here, because we do look very similar. And there's a lot of folks out there that there's inequality in the United States. There's inequality everywhere. But it's front page news. Wealth is having a bit of a moment in the US, a bit of a decade maybe. And I often wonder, has anyone ever asked, you won't know the answer to this question, has anyone ever asked Jeff Bezos, hey, did you set out to get rich? Or did you set out to build a company that delivers books and that it just expanded? Like, you didn't see this going on? Or do you think he saw this going in and saw that he would be the first trillionaire? He's not a trillionaire, but it's interesting that there are people that look at it and say, I want the signifiers of good relationship, the signifiers of wealth. I want that, but I'm not willing to put in the work. I'm not willing to make that effort. What do you say to them? Because we're coming from a place where I feel like I've earned, but I've also been pretty privileged. I've also been very lucky. So how do we communicate across that divide?
Well, it's a subject I've written about a lot. When economists pull apart luck and skill for anyone who is successful, luck predominates, right? If you mentioned Jeff Bezos, if he'd been born in sub-Saharan Africa, he would not be number one on the rich guy list. That's the starkest example, but there are others. My most popular post ever talks about birthday luck, I call it. And there's an idea in some cultures that you have this enormous bit of luck on your birthday. I think the good news is if you recognize how lucky you are, it is easier to try to be humble, which is really the best place to learn and support others. We live in a culture that worships pride and beating your own chest, and anything that can help us counter that a little bit is a good thing.
That's a great segue to the bias, overconfidence, etc.
Overconfident, self-serving.
Yeah,
if something good happens, it's because, boy, was I smart and I worked hard and I got it done, baby. And if something bad happens, it's, oh man, I was just unlucky.
Right.
Bad timing.
What are your three most often referenced biases that you think we walk around and we're not even aware that that's the definition of bias. We're not even aware that we have this issue. What are the three things to look out for?
Well, that's number one. The biggest one in my view is bias blindness. In theory, we all recognize that we make lots of mistakes, that we're wrong about a lot of stuff, at least in our honest moments. But we can never come up with pertinent examples.
Right.
We're wrong in theory. We're not wrong very often in practice, at least in our own minds. And so, and of course, that's partly just obvious, because if we thought something wasn't true, we wouldn't believe it. But all of us tend to think that, We have no trouble seeing bias in somebody else. We just never see it in ourselves. That's the biggest one. The other two, if you ask for three, there's the mother of all biases, which is confirmation bias. We see what we want to see in ourselves and others and in situations and in data and everything else. And the third is overconfidence. The good news is overconfidence is helpful in a lot of ways. No one would start a business if they weren't overconfident. No one would take big chances if they weren't overconfident because the odds are against them. And so that's really important. But boy, is it dangerous too. And balancing those two things is particularly difficult.
But so if I can just poke at something there, I mean, do you think that overconfidence is like a question of a personality trait? Or do you think it's something that we sort of come by, as like as a mental decision? Like let me explain what I mean. So like, if you're talking about the big five personality traits, right? Like one of the main ones is neurosis, and that has to do with like your capacity to feel negative emotion. And so like, for example, when I did that personality test, like I came up with a very low neurosis score. And one of the caveats that it put after that was like, well, you better watch out that you're not overconfident. I'm like, okay, yes, I do have a tendency to underestimate sometimes the negative potential or consequences that situations might have. And so I wonder if you think some of that is personality, or if you think it's mostly like a bad attitude that people come by somehow.
Actually, I think most of it is entirely natural. We all have it. Natural selection selects for it, because if you're not confident, you are less likely to survive. You're less likely to thrive. You're less likely to prosper. And so nature selects for it. But some of us have more of it than others. Kobe Bryant never would have made the last shot if he didn't take the last shot. And he wouldn't have taken the last shot if he wasn't overconfident about it, even though the data says his shooting percentage in those situations is not nearly as high as we remember. I've looked at this a little bit, the only great player who shoots the same percentage in clutch situations, depending on how you define clutch, but in clutch situations as opposed to all the time, is Michael Jordan. He doesn't make as many as you think he does.
I want to see Curry's numbers at the end. That's what I want to see. Curry's numbers.
Well, given where you live, yeah.
But I think if we kind of go back at like the point that I like that you made in there is this difference between maybe like perceptually what the actual data is, and then what we remember about it. Because like if let's say Kobe wins a few big games by taking a very famous shot, we might have a tendency to overestimate his shooting percentage. And as you say, clutch moments. So like I think that's a good example of like that kind of bias you were mentioning.
Yep, I think that's true.
Yeah. Okay, so if for the next question, you've written that information is cheap and meaning is expensive. I wonder if you could maybe comment on that or elaborate on it a little bit.
Sure. 150 years ago, information was incredibly expensive. Today, we have far more information than we know what to do with. Information couldn't be cheaper, although it's trying to get cheaper all the time. And the problem is what to do with the information, with the data, how you interpret it. Putting meaning to the information we have is really, really hard.
So, okay, there's too much data to analyze. We are really bad at making decisions. We're just infected with bias. And we just went through this election cycle in the US where truth was the big question, what's real? How do we know truth? How is it possible for us to get to truth given the volume of data and how inherently bad we are at looking at data.
My suspicion, to get back to your specific question, is lots of the dispute over what is really a dispute over what ought to be. It's the objection to the policy behind the is statement, not strictly to the is statement. But I suspect that much of the objection to it is the objection to the connection that so many scientists make between the reality of climate change to the necessary policy implications of that, which do not necessarily follow. So I think if we're careful to make the is ought distinction, that will help us. But I think the bigger problem is simply a matter of trust. We don't trust experts anymore, and that's largely because, and it also relates to is ought, that experts spin with confirmation bias all the time. It's an is ought question.
And then they never release their confidence. Like they maintain their confidence in
That's
a
right.
declining probability environment, right?
Correct.
I see that all the time. It drives me nuts.
I wanted to move on to kind of a different topic. And so like, I'm not as long of I haven't been reading your stuff for as long as Jonathan. I got into it, when this interview kind of became in the making. And what I found very interesting is that, so you have like this, a bunch of information that's kind of, financial and sometimes a bit cultural. And then your newsletter tends to end with like a Christian kind of a benediction. And for me, I found that combination of things a little bit unusual because in my understanding of a lot of Christian stuff, the quest for wealth gets a bit of a bad rap. And so I find it interesting, like, presumably you're on those two trains at the same time. You must be on some kind of a spiritual train on the one hand. And yet on the other hand, if you're in the financial services industry, obviously wealth creation is important to you. So do those trains meet for you somehow, or is there a way to bridge that gap, or is there not a gap? Am I setting up a kind of like a false dichotomy in my mind there?
Well, there is certainly a long Christian tradition, and it's not exclusively Christian, obviously, that how you use the wealth you have is of vital importance. Certainly, it is possible to accumulate wealth wrongly, but it is not wealth per se that's wrong. It presents problems, but it can influence us into choices we maybe shouldn't make. But there isn't inherent wrongness with wealth per se. What matters is how you acquire it and how you use it. And if you acquire it appropriately and use it appropriately, wealth can be a really powerful thing. Lots and lots of rich people have promised to give away most of their money, but almost all of them give it away after they're dead. The best spin we can put on it is they're using their wealth to take on very serious issues today, whether it's providing water to the world, or literacy, or health issues, all possible. Money is really challenging for all of us. And obviously it's challenging if you don't have enough of it. It's challenging if your life is a struggle and you have problems and misfortunes. It's a struggle when you start to do better, how to use it. I wrote about when I was my wife and I were newly married, and I was in law school, and she was teaching school for $6,000 a year, and we were supposed to go home for Christmas to both sets of parents, mine first. And we literally didn't know if we could go because we didn't have the money. And on the last day of school before Christmas vacation, there was an envelope on her desk with $100 in it, which covered the full gas money for us to go and come back. And we still don't know who it was that gave it to us, but Monty, if you're listening, we think it's you. But we don't know, and that has made an incredible impact on us ever since. That's the kind of thing you want to pay forward. And in our case, we only could pay forward because we didn't know who to pay back. And but then once you've achieved a certain level of success, money provides other problems, right? You have to decide what your priorities are, what you're gonna spend it on, and what you're not gonna spend it on. And in the financial world, and you'll see this also, I suspect, in tomorrow's Better Letter, the financial world is full of people saying something like, well, give up a latte every day and you can retire rich. And on the one hand, that can be a powerful lesson about compound interest. On the other hand, it's not crazy to want a good cup of coffee every day. And then when you get past the level where you're not worried about where your next meal is coming from, then you have to start thinking about how you're going to use your money to benefit others, and those are difficult choices too. And if I can help with those choices a little bit, I'll feel pretty good about what I've done at the end of the day.
Yeah,
Plus, those benedictions give me an opportunity to play more music.
Okay.
That's the paragraph before the benediction with all the this this is the funniest, this is the most mysterious, this is that's my, of all the things I read every single week, that is my favorite paragraph. It's so fun. So there's a lot of folks today that sort of look at things as becoming a little corrupted. Scott Galloway, Professor Galloway, talks about how it's bailouts on the way down. The most recent example is the airlines. I'm just curious, it seems to me that there is some underlying fervor that is hateful of capitalism at the moment. And I'm a huge capitalist. I believe in it, but I also think that it's a reasonable, it's a very, very, very reasonable statement to say that it doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem like those folks at the top of these companies and those companies are being treated the same way everyone else is being treated. It seems like they're getting kind of a pass. I'm just curious what you think about that.
I think you're right. I am a capitalist through and through, and the old joke about it is that capitalism is the worst system devised except for all the others, and there's truth in it, right? And if you don't have to read a lot of Solzhenitsyn to realize that the other extreme is a whole lot worse. But you're right. If the rule of law, by which I mean rules that apply fairly to everyone, isn't in place, there are going to be enormous problems. Not to mention, there's a famous essay called "The Tragedy of the Commons," where it discusses what to do about those things that have to be done by everyone together. Whether we're, the military is an obvious example, roads are a typical example, public education is often an example. Parks, for example. Those aren't, strictly speaking, capitalist values. Yet, the national park system is one of the great American treasures, and if Teddy Roosevelt had done nothing else, he would be remembered incredibly well for having done that. And so, as a society, we all have to face how to handle those kinds of issues, both in terms of making sure the rules apply to everyone, even those at the top, and to make sure benefits are provided fairly for the common good, without undercutting the power of capitalism. The power of capitalism, and if you're a Christian that believes in the doctrine of sin, capitalism makes sense because you can count on people to act in their own best interest. And so a system that assumes that is going to be more successful, but that doesn't mean that our sinful nature doesn't need to be tempered.
Well
Don't have to
said,
put a
sir.
theological spin on it, but
Just like the end of the newsletter.
there you go.
I wonder, like, so, like I said, I come more from real estate and less from, kind of financial markets.
The only place I know of
place.
you can get 10 times leverage for your household money.
Yeah. But so, I mean, is there a difference between, like, let's say the traditional form of, like Adam Smith type capitalism, like the nation of shopkeepers, that kind of capitalism, and the modern brand of investor capitalism that we have today? I mean, in some sense, there's a question of rules not applying fairly to everyone. And I think that existed throughout human history, however power was carved up, right? Like, let's say in monarchical systems or with aristocracies that are inherited, like those people had one set of rules for them and then everyone else had a different set of rules. But like, if we're talking about like the way that the capitalism as a system functions, I think there are different brands of capitalism. And so what exactly does our brand of capitalism now, what resemblance does that bear? And then, is there something inherently problematic with that?
Well, yes, there can be, at the risk of driving people crazy by putting my lawyer hat back on. Antitrust law over the last 30 years has changed significantly. There used to be two prongs to it, based A, if the consumer is damaged, or B, if we have created entities with monopoly power. And the second one in the law has mostly been done away with. So if you gather monopoly power, but the consumer benefits, it's difficult to succeed in an antitrust case. And I think that's a mistake. And it's something Congress could probably agree on if they weren't all performing all the time for the cameras instead did some actual legislative work, but that's a different story. I think we will start to see some natural changes, and that amongst the most fascinating pieces of research I've seen over the last 5 years is by a physicist named Jeffrey West, who wrote a book called Scale. And he looked at how cities grow, and he expanded it to companies and other entities. And he found that cities get more efficient as they grow. They get faster, and they can support more. Companies, on the other hand, grow sublinearly. They do not continue to get more efficient as they grow. Once they've hit critical mass, they start to get less efficient as they grow. And I've hypothesized that the reason no companies seem to be able to kick through the $1 trillion barrier in market cap is they just get less efficient. Um, and so, I think we see that. I used to joke when I worked on the street that if a merger was announced, 7 times out of 10 it was because at least one of the companies wasn't going to make their quarterly number, and so they wanted a merger so they could point to synergies, throw all their crap into that release, and say that the synergies will make it up, and they'd have at least a year of clear sailing with lousy numbers as the merger, which typically didn't help very much while they sorted that out. But I think we've seen over time that bigger is not necessarily better, and in fact, my working hypothesis about the small cap premium is that it's a matter of scale, not a matter of risk, and so it's frustrating to have to wait for nature to take its course, so to speak. And I'm not advising that, but I think there are reasons to think size, in fact, does matter.
I think that's a good closing note, actually. I think you did that on purpose, actually, Bob. That's great. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to staying in touch and reading the better letter tomorrow.
Thanks. I appreciate your having me. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks for listening. Whether you tuned in while you were taking a walk or maybe doing the dishes, or whether you were sitting at your desk and diligently taking notes, I hope you get something out of this conversation. And when you go back into the world, perhaps you focus a little bit less on those external markers of success. Or maybe you'll be able to see the ways in which you've been lucky. Or you might be able to better tell when it's the biases that are talking. I know that I'm going to remember that everyone struggles with money. However much money one can access, there's a struggle that comes along with that amount of money. I'm sure Bob's going to agree with me when I say that I'd rather deal with having more than having less, but we can all be a little bit more aware that we don't know someone else's experience. Thanks again for listening. I hope you subscribe and maybe go back and listen to this one again, and then be sure to tune in to our next episode.